The flight crew saw a man in raggedy clothes boarding their plane and assumed he was flying on charity tickets. What they didn't know was that James Washington's $120 million private jet was grounded for maintenance, forcing the billionaire philanthropist who had donated $2 billion to homeless shelters to fly commercial for the first time in years. Flight AA-892 from Miami to Boston was scheduled for departure at 4:45 p.m. from Miami International Airport's Terminal D, carrying 165 passengers on what should have been a routine 3-hour domestic journey. The Boeing 737-800 had been in service for American Airlines for just 18 months, representing part of their fleet modernization program designed to improve fuel efficiency and passenger comfort across their domestic route network. James Washington stood in the boarding line wearing clothes that told a story of hardship and struggle, a faded denim jacket with patches sewn over holes, worn jeans that had seen better days, and sneakers that were clean but obviously old and well used. To any casual observer, he appeared to be exactly what many people unfortunately expected to see when they thought about individuals experiencing homelessness or severe financial hardship. The reality, however, was far more complex and ironic than anyone around him could have imagined. James Washington was the founder and CEO of Washington Technologies, a revolutionary software development company that had created groundbreaking applications for financial services, healthcare systems, and educational institutions across North America. His personal net worth exceeded $8.5 billion, making him one of the wealthiest individuals in the United States under the age of 45. More importantly for today's journey, James was also the founder and primary benefactor of the Washington Foundation for Human Dignity, a charitable organization that had donated over $2 billion to homeless shelters, food banks, job training programs, and affordable housing initiatives in major cities across the United States and Canada. His foundation's work had directly helped over 500,000 individuals transition from homelessness to stable housing and employment, making him one of the most impactful philanthropists in the field of social justice and poverty alleviation. James had chosen to dress in modest, worn clothing for a specific and deeply personal reason. Earlier that morning, he had spent 4 hours volunteering at the Miami-Dade Homeless Services Center, serving breakfast to individuals and families who were experiencing housing insecurity. It was his weekly routine whenever he traveled to Miami for business, and he always dressed in simple clothes to ensure that the people he served felt comfortable and weren't intimidated by obvious displays of wealth or status. Today's volunteer session had been particularly meaningful because James had been meeting with families who would soon be moving into new affordable housing units that his foundation had helped fund and develop. Seeing their excitement and hope as they prepared for this life-changing transition had reminded him once again why his philanthropic work was so important and personally fulfilling. However, his usual private jet, a Gulfstream G650 that he used for both business travel and foundation site visits, was currently undergoing scheduled maintenance at a specialized facility in Fort Lauderdale. The maintenance was expected to take 3 days, and James had an important board meeting in Boston that couldn't be postponed. Rather than charter another private aircraft, he had decided to experience commercial air travel for the first time in over 6 years. His executive assistant, Maria Santos, had booked him an economy-class seat under his real name, thinking it would be an interesting experience for someone who typically traveled in the luxury and privacy of private aviation. Neither James nor Maria had anticipated how his appearance might be perceived by airline staff and fellow passengers who would make assumptions based solely on his modest clothing. As James approached the gate agent to present his boarding pass, he noticed the woman's expression shift from professional courtesy to barely concealed disdain as she took in his appearance. The gate agent, whose name tag read Patricia Collins, looked at his boarding pass as if she expected to find some kind of error or problem. "Sir, this boarding pass shows economy class, seat 23C, Patricia said, her tone suggesting that she was somehow doing him a favor by allowing him to board at all.
James nodded politely, accustomed to various forms of social interaction from his years of volunteer work and community engagement. "Thank you, I'll wait for my group." What James didn't realize was that Patricia had already made several assumptions about him entirely based on his appearance. In her mind, he was likely traveling on some kind of charity assistance program or heavily discounted ticket, and she felt that he should be grateful for whatever accommodation the airline was providing rather than expecting normal customer service. As Group 4 was called for boarding, James joined the line and made his way through the jet bridge toward the aircraft. The airline staff positioned at the plane's entrance greeted passengers with varying degrees of warmth and attention, but when James reached the doorway, the reception was notably different.
Senior flight attendant Michelle Rodriguez looked at James with obvious skepticism, as if his presence on the aircraft represented some kind of mistake or administrative error. Rather than offering the standard welcome greeting that other passengers had received, she immediately focused on his boarding pass with suspicion. "Sir, can you show me your boarding pass again?" Michelle asked, her voice carrying an undertone of authority mixed with doubt. James handed over his boarding pass without complaint, though he was beginning to notice the differential treatment he was receiving compared to other passengers who had boarded ahead of him. Michelle examined the boarding pass more thoroughly than was necessary, checking and rechecking a seat assignment, as if she expected to discover fraud or forgery. The document clearly showed his name, James Washington, seat 23C in economy class, with all the appropriate codes and stamps indicating a legitimate reservation purchased through standard channels. "Is there a problem with my seat assignment?" James asked politely, maintaining the same calm demeanor he used during difficult business negotiations or challenging community outreach situations. "No, everything appears to be in order," Michelle replied reluctantly, though her tone suggested continued skepticism about James's right to be on the aircraft. "Economy class is toward the back of the plane. Follow the aisle and look for row 23. As James made his way through the aircraft toward his assigned seat, he couldn't help but notice the reactions of other passengers and crew members. Some people looked at him with curiosity, others with subtle expressions of discomfort or judgment. A few passengers appeared to be taking photos with their smartphones, though he couldn't be sure whether they were documenting his appearance or simply taking pictures of their travel experience. The economy class section of the Boeing 737 was configured with 6 seats across in each row, divided into 2 sections of 3 seats each with a narrow aisle down the middle. James located row 23 and found his assigned window seat, 23C, next to a middle-aged businessman who was already absorbed in his laptop computer. As James settled into his seat and stowed his small backpack under the seat in front of him, he became aware that Michelle Rodriguez was hovering nearby, apparently monitoring his behavior as if she expected him to cause some kind of disturbance or problem. "Sir," Michelle said, approaching his row with obvious reluctance, "I need to remind you that this is a non-smoking flight, and alcohol consumption is limited to beverages served by the crew. We also don't allow loitering in the aisles or disturbing other passengers." James found this series of warnings both unnecessary and insulting, as he had done nothing to suggest that he would violate any airline policies or behave inappropriately during the flight. The fact that Michelle felt compelled to deliver these reminders specifically to him while not addressing other passengers with similar warnings suggested that her assumptions were based on his appearance rather than his actual behavior. "I understand the policies," James replied calmly. "Thank you for the information." The businessman seated in 23B looked up from his laptop with a mixture of curiosity and concern, clearly sensing the tension in Michelle's interaction with James. After the flight attendant moved away, he leaned slightly toward James and spoke quietly. "I'm sorry about that. She seemed to be treating you differently than other passengers. I'm Robert Chen, by the way." James appreciated the man's kindness and willingness to acknowledge what they had both observed. "Thank you for saying that. I'm James Washington. Sometimes people make assumptions based on appearances." Robert nodded with understanding. "I travel frequently for business, and I've noticed that airline staff can be inconsistent in how they treat different passengers. It's not right, but unfortunately it happens." Their conversation was interrupted by another flight attendant, Kevin Martinez, who was working his way through the economy cabin, ensuring that passengers were properly seated and that luggage was securely stowed. Unlike Michelle's suspicious and unwelcoming approach, Kevin greeted James with genuine professionalism and courtesy.
"Good afternoon, Mr. Washington. Is this your first time flying with American Airlines?" Kevin asked, checking James's seatbelt and ensuring he was comfortable. "It's been a while since I've flown commercially," James replied, appreciating Kevin's respectful treatment. "Thank you for asking." Kevin's professional demeanor and inclusive customer service stood in sharp contrast to Michelle's prejudicial assumptions, demonstrating that not all airline employees shared the same biases or made the same discriminatory judgments about passengers based on their appearance. As the aircraft prepared for departure, James reflected on the differential treatment he had already experienced during the boarding process. His volunteer work with homeless populations had given him first-hand understanding of how quickly people could make judgments about others based on clothing, appearance, or social status. However, experiencing such treatment personally while traveling commercially was both educational and deeply troubling. Flight AA-892 pushed back from the gate on schedule and began its taxi toward the runway for departure. James had deliberately chosen a window seat so he could observe the airport operations and think about the irony of his situation. Somewhere on the tarmac below, his own private jet sat in a maintenance hangar worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes, while he was being treated as a second-class citizen by airline staff who had made assumptions about his financial circumstances and social status. During takeoff, James noticed that Michelle Rodriguez continued to pay particular attention to his section of the aircraft, frequently looking in his direction as if he expected him to cause some kind of disturbance or problem. His obvious suspicion was creating an uncomfortable atmosphere not only for James but also for nearby passengers who could sense the tension and differential treatment occurring. Robert Chen, the businessman seated next to James, had been observing Michelle's behavior throughout the boarding and takeoff process. As someone who traveled extensively for his work in international trade and had witnessed various forms of discrimination in different countries and cultures, he recognized the pattern of prejudicial treatment that James was experiencing. "This is really bothering me," Robert said quietly to James as the aircraft reached cruising altitude. "The way that flight attendant has been treating you is completely inappropriate. Have you considered filing a complaint with the airline?" James appreciated Robert's concern and support, but he was also thinking about how this experience could potentially be used as a learning opportunity rather than simply a complaint to be filed and forgotten. "I'm definitely documenting what's happening," he replied. "Sometimes these situations can become opportunities for broader education and change." What Robert didn't know was that James had been discreetly recording portions of his interactions with airline staff using his smartphone, not for the purpose of creating problems or seeking personal compensation, but because he understood that documented examples of discriminatory behavior could be valuable for training programs and policy development initiatives that might prevent similar treatment of other passengers in the future. As the flight continued toward Boston, James began to consider how his experience on Flight AA-892 might inform his foundation's future work in addressing not just homelessness and poverty, but also the broader social attitudes and prejudices that contributed to the marginalization of vulnerable populations. The assumptions that Michelle Rodriguez had made about him based on his clothing were similar to the judgments that housed individuals often made about people experiencing homelessness, creating barriers to employment, housing, and social integration. The irony of his situation was profound and deeply meaningful. Here I was, one of the most generous philanthropists in the country, working to help people transition out of homelessness, being treated poorly by airline staff who assumed he was homeless himself. The experience was providing him with invaluable first-hand insight into the daily discrimination and prejudice that the people his foundation served encountered in their interactions with institutions, businesses, and service providers.
As Flight AA-892 continued its journey toward Boston, the discriminatory treatment that James Washington had experienced during boarding was about to escalate into a full-scale confrontation that would be documented, shared, and discussed by millions of people around the world. What had begun as subtle prejudice based on his modest appearance was rapidly developing into a textbook example of how unconscious bias could create hostile environments for passengers who didn't conform to flight crew expectations. Michelle Rodriguez had been monitoring James's section of the economy cabin with obvious suspicion throughout the first hour of the flight, making frequent passes through the aisle and pausing near his seat to observe his behavior.
Her actions were creating an atmosphere of tension that was becoming increasingly noticeable to other passengers, many of whom were beginning to feel uncomfortable with the obvious differential treatment being directed toward the man in worn clothing. The meal service provided Michelle with another opportunity to demonstrate her prejudicial assumptions about James's circumstances and social status. As she moved through the cabin with the refreshment cart, she provided detailed explanations of available options to most passengers, offered recommendations about beverage selections, and maintained professional courtesy throughout her interactions. When Michelle reached James's row, however, her approach became markedly different. Rather than offering the standard menu options and courteous service that other passengers had received, she addressed him with barely concealed impatience and obvious reluctance. "What do you want to drink?" Michelle asked curtly, without providing any information about available beverages or showing the courtesy she had extended to other travelers in the same cabin section. James maintained his composure despite the rude treatment, understanding that his response would set the tone for the remainder of the interaction. "Could I please see the beverage menu and hear about the snack options available?" Michelle's expression showed clear irritation at James's request for the same information she had automatically provided to other passengers. In her mind, someone dressed as modestly as James should be grateful for whatever basic service was offered, rather than expecting detailed explanations or multiple options. "We have Coke, Sprite, orange juice, coffee, and water," Michelle said dismissively, without mentioning the additional beverage choices that she had described to previous passengers, including premium options and cocktails that were available for purchase. Robert Chen, who had been observing this interaction with growing dismay, decided to intervene diplomatically. "Excuse me, but didn't you mention wine and beer options to the passengers ahead of us? I think Mr. Washington should have access to the same menu choices." Michelle's face flushed with annoyance at being challenged by another passenger about her service procedures, but she also realized that her differential treatment was becoming obvious to witnesses who might complain to airline management. "Those beverages are available for purchase," Michelle replied stiffly, clearly resenting the implication that she had been providing unequal service. James appreciated Robert's advocacy, but he was also becoming increasingly interested in documenting the discrimination he was experiencing, rather than escalating the immediate confrontation. "I'll just have a coffee, please. Thank you." Kevin Martinez, the junior flight attendant who had shown professionalism and courtesy during the boarding process, happened to be passing through the cabin during this exchange. He immediately noticed the tension in Michelle's interaction with James and the obvious discomfort of surrounding passengers. Kevin had received extensive training in customer service excellence and diversity awareness during his employment orientation with American Airlines, and he recognized that Michelle's behavior violated both company policies and basic standards of professional courtesy. As someone committed to treating all passengers with equal respect, regardless of their appearance or perceived circumstances, he felt compelled to address the situation. "Mr. Washington, I want to make sure you're receiving the same level of service as all our other passengers. Can I get you anything else to make your flight more comfortable?" Kevin's intervention served multiple purposes. It provided James with the respectful treatment he deserved. It demonstrated to other passengers that not all crew members shared Michelle's prejudicial attitudes. And it sent a clear message to Michelle that her discriminatory behavior was being observed and would not be tolerated by other staff members. Michelle realized that Kevin's professional approach was making her own behavior appear even more inappropriate by comparison, which increased her resentment toward both James and her colleague who was challenging her authority through his actions.
"Kevin, I can handle the service in this section," Michelle said sharply, her tone suggesting that she viewed his intervention as insubordination rather than customer advocacy. Kevin maintained his professional composure while making it clear that he intended to ensure all passengers received appropriate service. "I'm just making sure all our guests feel welcomed and respected during their flight with us." The exchange between the two flight attendants was drawing attention from passengers throughout the economy cabin, many of whom were beginning to take photos and videos with their smartphones as they recognized that they were witnessing something significant and potentially newsworthy. Dr. Patricia Williams, a social justice advocate and documentary filmmaker who was traveling in seat 25A, had been observing the entire sequence of discriminatory treatment that James had experienced since boarding. As someone whose work focused on exposing systemic inequality and prejudice in various institutions, she immediately recognized the educational and advocacy value of documenting this incident. Dr. Williams began recording video footage of Michelle's interactions with James, capturing both the discriminatory service and Kevin's professional response to the situation. Her documentation would soon become crucial evidence in the viral spread of James' story and the accountability measures that would follow. Meanwhile, James was using his own smartphone to discreetly record audio of his interactions with airline staff, understanding that documented evidence would be essential if he decided to file formal complaints or use this experience as part of his foundation's educational initiatives about prejudice and social justice. The tension in the cabin continued to escalate when Michelle returned to James's section during the second beverage service, approximately 2 hours into the flight. This time, her approach was even more hostile and confrontational, as if she resented his continued presence on the aircraft and wanted to establish her authority over someone she perceived as being beneath her social status. "Sir, I've received complaints from other passengers about disruptions in this section," Michelle announced loudly, speaking in a voice that was clearly intended to be heard by surrounding travelers. "I need you to keep any conversations quiet and avoid disturbing other guests." This accusation was completely fabricated, as James had been sitting quietly throughout the flight, engaging only in brief, whispered conversations with Robert Chen and responding politely to Kevin Martinez's customer service efforts. Michelle's statement was designed to publicly embarrass James and justify further discriminatory treatment by creating a false narrative of problematic behavior. Robert Chen immediately spoke up to contradict Michelle's false accusation. "That's not true. Mr. Washington has been completely quiet and respectful throughout this entire flight. I haven't heard any complaints from anyone in this section." Other passengers within earshot began nodding in agreement with Robert's assessment, making it clear that they had observed no disruptive behavior from James and were instead becoming concerned about Michelle's increasingly aggressive and unprofessional conduct. Dr. Williams, who had been documenting the entire exchange, stood up from her seat to address Michelle directly. "I'm Dr. Patricia Williams, and I've been observing your treatment of this passenger since boarding. Your behavior appears to be discriminatory and is creating a hostile environment for everyone in this section." Michelle was shocked to find herself being challenged by multiple passengers who were supporting James and criticizing her professional conduct. In her 12 years with American Airlines, she had never experienced such direct confrontation about her customer service approach, and she was unsure how to respond to the growing criticism. "I'm just trying to maintain order and ensure passenger safety," Michelle said defensively, falling back on standard airline language about safety protocols without being able to specify any actual safety concerns related to James's behavior. Dr. Williams was not satisfied with this generic explanation. "What specific safety concerns are you addressing? This passenger has been sitting quietly and following all airline regulations throughout the flight. Your treatment of him appears to be based on his appearance rather than his conduct." The confrontation was now drawing attention from passengers throughout the economy cabin, with many people standing up or leaning into the aisles to observe the exchange between Michelle and the growing number of passengers who were defending James against discriminatory treatment. Captain Robert Harrison, who had been monitoring cabin communications from the cockpit, became aware of the developing situation when Kevin Martinez contacted him through the internal communication system to report concerns about passenger comfort and crew behavior in the economy section. "Captain, "We have a situation developing in the back of the plane. There's been some inappropriate treatment of a passenger that's creating tension among other travelers. I think you need to be aware of what's happening," Kevin reported. Captain Harrison had 25 years in commercial aviation and understood that passenger conflicts could quickly escalate into safety issues if not handled properly. He also knew that discriminatory treatment of passengers could result in serious legal consequences for both individual employees and the airline as a whole. "I'll come back and assess the situation. Can you provide me with a brief summary of what occurred?" Kevin explained the pattern of discriminatory service that Michelle had provided to James, the false accusations about disruptive behavior, and the growing number of passengers who were expressing concern about the unfair treatment they had witnessed. When Captain Harrison arrived in the economy cabin, he immediately observed the tense atmosphere and the obvious division between Michelle, who appeared defensive and isolated, and the multiple passengers who were clearly supporting James against what they perceived as discriminatory treatment. "Good afternoon, everyone," Captain Harrison said, in a calm, authoritative voice designed to de-escalate the situation. "I understand there may be some concerns about passenger service. I'd like to speak with everyone involved to make sure we can resolve any issues and ensure a comfortable flight for all our travelers." James stood up to address the captain directly, appreciating the opportunity to provide his perspective on the discriminatory treatment he had been experiencing. "Captain Harrison, I'm James Washington, and I want to thank you for coming to address this situation. I've been experiencing differential treatment from one of your crew members since boarding, and several other passengers have witnessed the discrimination." Captain Harrison immediately noted that James was articulate, respectful, and professional in his communication, showing none of the problematic behavior that would justify the special attention Michelle claimed to be addressing.
Mr. Washington, can you describe the specific issues you've experienced during your flight?" the captain asked, taking out a notebook to document the passenger's concerns for his incident report. James provided a calm, factual account of Michelle's behavior, from the suspicious examination of his boarding pass during boarding to the fabricated accusations about disruptive conduct during the flight. He emphasized that other passengers had witnessed these interactions and could corroborate his description of events. Robert Chen immediately stepped forward to support James' account. "Captain, I've been sitting next to Mr. Washington throughout this flight, and everything he's telling you is accurate. The treatment he's received from your crew member has been completely inappropriate and appears to be based solely on his appearance." Dr. Williams also offered her testimony as a witness to the discriminatory behavior. "Captain, I'm a documentary filmmaker who works on social justice issues, and I've been recording portions of this interaction because it represents clear evidence of discrimination. The passenger has done nothing to warrant the treatment he's received." Captain Harrison realized that he was dealing with multiple credible witnesses who were describing a pattern of discriminatory behavior by one of his crew members. The situation had the potential to become a major public relations and legal problem for American Airlines if not handled appropriately. "Michelle, I'd like to speak with you privately about these concerns," Captain Harrison said, gesturing toward the galley area where they could have a discreet conversation away from passenger observation. During their private discussion, Captain Harrison asked Michelle to explain her treatment of James and justify the service decisions she had made throughout the flight. Michelle continued to defend her actions by claiming that she had been following standard safety procedures and responding to passenger complaints, but she was unable to provide specific evidence to support these claims. "Michelle, multiple passengers are contradicting your account of this situation," Captain Harrison said seriously. "They're describing behavior that appears to be discriminatory and unprofessional. This is exactly the kind of incident that can result in federal civil rights complaints and significant legal consequences for both you and the airline." Michelle began to realize that her assumptions and biased treatment of James had created a situation that could potentially end her career with American Airlines. The captain's serious tone and reference to legal consequences made it clear that this was not going to be dismissed as a minor customer service issue.
While Captain Harrison was addressing the crew situation, James was having an important realization about how his experience on Flight AA-892 could become a powerful educational tool for his foundation's work in addressing prejudice and social justice issues. The documented evidence of discrimination he had experienced, combined with the support he had received from fellow passengers, demonstrated both the persistence of bias and the potential for ordinary people to stand up against injustice when they witnessed it. James pulled out his smartphone and made a quiet phone call to his executive assistant, Maria Santos, who managed communications and strategic planning for both Washington Technologies and the Washington Foundation for Human Dignity. Maria, I'm currently experiencing a significant discrimination incident on American Airlines Flight AA-892. I want you to prepare for immediate media response and documentation of what's occurring. This could become an important case study for our Foundation's educational initiatives. Maria Santos had worked with James for over 8 years and understood both his business operations and his commitment to social justice advocacy. She immediately began preparing comprehensive response strategies that would maximize the educational and advocacy impact of his experience. James, are you safe and is the situation under control? Maria asked, her primary concern being his personal well-being rather than the potential publicity implications. Yes, I'm fine, and several passengers are supporting me against the discriminatory treatment. The captain is now involved and seems to be taking the situation seriously, but I want to use this experience to highlight the ongoing challenges that people face when they're judged based on their appearance rather than their character. Maria understood the broader implications of James's experience and began coordinating with the Foundation's communications team, legal advisors, and social media specialists to prepare for what could become a viral story about discrimination, prejudice, and the power of bystander intervention. Dr. Williams had already begun uploading portions of her video documentation to social media platforms, with initial posts generating significant attention and comments from viewers who were shocked by the clear evidence of discriminatory treatment that James had experienced. The viral spread of James's story was just beginning, but it would soon reach millions of people around the world and spark important conversations about prejudice, assumptions based on appearance, and the responsibility of institutions to treat all customers with equal dignity. James Washington's modest appearance had fooled airline staff into treating him poorly, but his true identity and the power of documented discrimination were about to create one of the most impactful social justice stories in recent aviation history.
Within 6 hours of Flight AA-892 landing at Boston Logan International Airport, James Washington's experience of discrimination had evolved from a single incident of poor customer service into a viral social media phenomenon that would fundamentally change how airlines approach customer service training and bias recognition. The video footage that Dr. Patricia Williams had captured during the flight was already generating millions of views across multiple platforms, creating unprecedented public attention around issues of prejudice, assumptions based on appearance, and the responsibility of service industries to treat all customers with equal dignity and respect. The initial social media posts had been shared by Dr. Williams immediately after landing, with her professional credibility as a documentary filmmaker and social justice advocate lending immediate authenticity and gravity to the footage she had captured. Her first Twitter post, accompanied by a 2-minute video compilation showing Michelle Rodriguez's discriminatory treatment of James, was shared over 50,000 times within the first 4 hours and generated thousands of comments expressing outrage at the clear evidence of biased service. "This is what discrimination looks like in 2024, Dr. Williams had written in her post. A passenger treated poorly because of his appearance, while other travelers received professional courtesy. The man being discriminated against handled the situation with remarkable grace and dignity. Airlines must do better." The video showed Michelle's suspicious examination of James's boarding pass, her curt and unprofessional service during the beverage service, her fabricated accusations about disruptive behavior, and the supportive responses from other passengers who witnessed the discriminatory treatment. Most importantly, it captured James's calm, respectful demeanor throughout the entire sequence of events, making it impossible for viewers to justify Michelle's behavior based on any actual misconduct by the passenger. James's executive assistant, Maria Santos, had been monitoring the viral spread of this story from the Washington Foundation headquarters in Seattle, coordinating with the organization's communications team to prepare for what was rapidly becoming a major media event. Her years of experience managing James's public relations and philanthropic communications had taught her to recognize when a story had the potential to create significant social impact, and this incident was clearly reaching that threshold. "James, the video is trending on every major social media platform," Maria reported during their phone conversation as James waited for his luggage at Boston Logan Airport. "We're receiving calls from major news networks, civil rights organizations, and advocacy groups who want to discuss your experience and its implications for airline industry practices." James was both surprised and pleased by the rapid public response to his experience, recognizing that the viral attention could provide an unprecedented platform for educating people about the ongoing challenges of prejudice and discrimination in everyday interactions with service providers and institutions. "James, I want to use this opportunity to highlight not just my individual experience, but the broader issues of bias and assumptions that affect millions of people who don't have the resources or platform to address discriminatory treatment," James said. "Let's prepare for media interviews that focus on education and systemic change rather than personal grievances or individual compensation." Meanwhile, American Airlines headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas, was experiencing its own crisis as the company's communications and legal teams scrambled to respond to the growing media attention and public criticism generated by the viral video footage. CEO Robert Isom had been personally briefed on the incident and understood immediately that the airline faced significant reputational damage and potential legal liability if the situation was not handled swiftly and comprehensively. The airline's initial response had been a standard corporate statement expressing concern about the allegations and promising a thorough investigation of the incident. However, the compelling video evidence and the rapidly growing public outrage made it clear that generic corporate language would be inadequate to address the severity of the situation and the expectations for meaningful accountability. Michelle Rodriguez, who had completed her shift and returned to her hotel in Boston, was completely unaware of the viral attention her behavior had generated, until she received an urgent phone call from American Airlines Human Resources Department requesting her immediate participation in a disciplinary investigation. The HR representative informed her that video footage of her interactions with a passenger had been shared widely on social media and was generating significant negative publicity for the airline. "Michelle Rodriguez, we need you to return to the airport immediately for an emergency meeting with management representatives. There are serious allegations about discriminatory treatment of a passenger, and we have video evidence that needs to be addressed." Michelle was shocked to learn that her treatment of James had been recorded and shared publicly, but she continued to defend her actions as appropriate customer service procedures designed to maintain safety and order on the aircraft. Her inability to recognize the discriminatory nature of her behavior, even when confronted with video evidence and witness testimony, demonstrated exactly the kind of unconscious bias that James's foundation worked to address through education and training programs.
Kevin Martinez, the junior flight attendant whose professional behavior had contrasted sharply with Michelle's discrimination, was also contacted by airline management, but for very different reasons. His respectful treatment of James and his willingness to intervene when he witnessed inappropriate behavior had been captured in Dr. Williams' video footage and was generating positive attention for American Airlines amid the otherwise negative coverage. "Kevin, we want to commend you for the professionalism you demonstrated during this difficult situation," the airline's customer service director told him during their phone conversation. "Your actions represent exactly the kind of customer advocacy and ethical leadership we expect from all our employees." Kevin appreciated the recognition, but he was primarily concerned about ensuring that the incident led to meaningful changes in airline policies and training programs that would prevent similar discrimination from occurring in the future. "I just did what I thought was right," he replied. "But I hope this situation helps us all learn how to better serve passengers regardless of their appearance or background." As news outlets across the country began picking up the story, James found himself at the center of a national conversation about discrimination, customer service standards, and the responsibility of corporations to address bias in their service delivery. The major networks were requesting interviews, civil rights organizations were offering their support, and advocacy groups were using his experience as an example of ongoing challenges in achieving equal treatment for all citizens. The Boston Globe published the first major newspaper article about James' experience within 12 hours of his flight landing, with reporter Sarah Mitchell providing a comprehensive account of the incident that included interviews with passenger witnesses, expert analysis from civil rights attorneys, and context about ongoing discrimination issues in the airline industry. The treatment of passenger James Washington on American Airlines Flight AA-892 represents a textbook example of unconscious bias in customer service, the article stated. Despite having valid documentation and behaving appropriately throughout the flight, Washington was subjected to suspicious scrutiny, substandard service, and false accusations based solely on his modest appearance. The article resonated with readers who shared their own experiences of similar discrimination in various service industries, creating a growing repository of evidence that James' experience was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of biased treatment that affected countless individuals on a daily basis. Dr. Williams, whose video documentation had made the viral spread of the story possible, was invited to appear on several national television programs to discuss her observations and the broader implications of the discriminatory treatment she had witnessed and recorded. What struck me most about this incident was not just the obvious discrimination, but the remarkable dignity and composure that Mr. Washington maintained throughout the entire experience, Dr. Williams explained during her CNN interview. He never became argumentative or defensive, despite being treated in a way that would have justifiably angered most people. The interview generated additional social media discussion and sharing, with viewers praising both James's gracious response to discrimination and Dr. Williams' willingness to document and share evidence of the inappropriate treatment she had witnessed and recorded. Meanwhile, Robert Chen, the businessman who had sat next to James during the flight and had been one of his most consistent supporters, was contacted by reporters who wanted his perspective on the incident as a witness to the discriminatory behavior. Mr. Washington was the most polite and respectful passenger on that entire flight, Robert told the Washington Post. The treatment he received from the flight attendant was completely inappropriate and seemed to be based entirely on assumptions about his appearance rather than his actual behavior. Robert's testimony, combined with the video evidence and other passenger witnesses, created an overwhelming body of evidence that made it impossible for American Airlines to dismiss the incident as a misunderstanding or minor customer service failure. As the story continued to gain national attention, James made the decision to reveal his true identity and use his platform as a successful philanthropist to amplify the educational message he wanted to convey about prejudice and social justice. Working with Maria Santos and the Washington Foundation's communications team, he prepared for a comprehensive media campaign that would transform his personal experience into a broader advocacy initiative. The revelation of James's identity as a billionaire philanthropist who had donated over $2 billion to homeless services added an additional layer of irony and impact to his story. The fact that someone who had dedicated his career and fortune to helping people experiencing homelessness had been discriminated against because he was assumed to be homeless himself created a powerful narrative that resonated with audiences across different demographic and political groups. The irony of this situation is profound and educational, James explained during his first television interview after revealing his identity. I was treated poorly because airline staff assumed I was homeless, while in reality, I've spent years working to help people transition out of homelessness and into stable housing and employment. The interview, conducted by Anderson Cooper on CNN, was watched by over 8 million viewers and generated extensive discussion on social media platforms about the persistence of bias and the importance of treating all people with dignity regardless of their appearance or perceived circumstances. James used the platform to announce that the Washington Foundation would be launching a new initiative focused on addressing discrimination in service industries, with American Airlines serving as a pilot program for comprehensive bias training and policy reform efforts that could eventually be implemented across multiple sectors. "We're not interested in punishment or revenge," James emphasized during the interview. "We're interested in education, understanding, and systematic change that creates more respectful and inclusive experiences for everyone." American Airlines CEO Robert Isom, recognizing the severity of the situation and the opportunity to demonstrate genuine corporate accountability, announced that the airline would be implementing the most comprehensive anti-discrimination training program in the industry, developed in partnership with the Washington Foundation and other civil rights organizations. "The treatment that Mr. Washington experienced on our aircraft was unacceptable and does not represent our values or our commitment to serving all customers with dignity and respect," Isom stated during a press conference at American Airlines headquarters. The announcement included specific commitments to policy changes, employee training improvements, and ongoing monitoring systems that would be overseen by independent civil rights experts. Michelle Rodriguez was terminated from her position with American Airlines, while Kevin Martinez was promoted to senior flight attendant with additional responsibilities for customer service training and advocacy. The comprehensive corporate response to James' experience became a model for how companies could address discrimination incidents through meaningful accountability measures rather than generic apologies and minor policy adjustments. Business schools began using the American Airlines case study to teach students about crisis management, corporate social responsibility, and the business value of genuine diversity and inclusion initiatives. James's story also inspired legislative action, with several members of Congress introducing bills that would strengthen federal protections against discrimination in transportation services and increase penalties for companies that failed to address bias in their customer service practices. Senator Elizabeth Warren, who had been following the story closely, invited James to testify before the Senate Commerce Committee about his experience and recommendations for improving civil rights enforcement in the airline industry. Mr. Washington's experience demonstrates that despite decades of civil rights legislation, discrimination based on appearance and assumptions about social status continues to affect Americans in their daily interactions with service providers, Senator Warren stated during the committee hearing. "We need stronger enforcement mechanisms and real accountability to ensure that all citizens are treated with equal dignity and respect." James's testimony before Congress was broadcast live and reached millions of additional viewers, further amplifying his message about the importance of addressing unconscious bias and creating more inclusive environments in all aspects of society. The Washington Foundation's partnership with American Airlines became a comprehensive case study in corporate transformation, with the airline implementing training programs, policy changes, and monitoring systems that resulted in dramatic improvements in customer satisfaction scores and reductions in discrimination complaints. Within 6 months of the Flight AA-892 incident, American Airlines had become the industry leader in diversity and inclusion initiatives, with other major airlines adopting similar programs based on the successful model that James had helped develop. The viral video of James's experience continued to be used in training programs, educational initiatives, and advocacy campaigns around the world, serving as a powerful example of how individual experiences with discrimination could be transformed into catalysts for systematic change that benefited entire communities. Dr. Patricia Williams, whose documentation had made the viral spread of the story possible, collaborated with James on a
5 years after Flight AA-892,
James Washington stood before the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, delivering a keynote address about the global impact of his discrimination experience and the systematic changes it had inspired across industries worldwide. The modest man who had once been judged solely by his worn clothing had become one of the most influential voices in international civil rights advocacy. Discrimination knows no borders, James told the Assembly of Representatives from 193 nations. My experience on that flight was not unique to America or to airlines. It represents a universal human tendency to judge others based on appearance rather than character, and it requires universal solutions. The Washington Foundation's Dignity and Service initiative had expanded far beyond its origins in airline customer service, now operating in 47 countries and training over 500,000 service industry employees annually in bias recognition and respectful treatment protocols. The program's success had attracted attention from the World Bank, which was funding similar initiatives in developing nations, where discrimination in service delivery posed barriers to economic development and social progress. Dr. Patricia Williams, whose viral video documentation had launched the movement, now served as the Foundation's Director of Global Communications and had just received the International Documentary Association's Lifetime Achievement Award for her work exposing discrimination through digital media. Her techniques for capturing and sharing evidence of bias had been adopted by civil rights organizations worldwide, creating new accountability mechanisms for institutions that had previously operated without external oversight. American Airlines, once the target of international criticism for its discriminatory practices, had become the most awarded airline in the world for customer service excellence and diversity initiatives. CEO Robert Isom had been invited to speak at business schools and corporate leadership conferences about the transformation process that had converted a public relations disaster into a model of corporate accountability and social responsibility. Kevin Martinez, the flight attendant whose professional behavior had contrasted with Michelle Rodriguez's discrimination, was now American Airlines Vice President of Customer Experience and Diversity Initiatives. His journey from junior crew member to corporate executive had been documented in business publications as an example of how ethical leadership during crisis moments could create opportunities for career advancement and organizational impact. The real lesson of Flight AA-892 wasn't about one passenger's experience or one employee's mistakes. It was about how organizations respond when their values are tested, and how individual employees can either perpetuate discrimination or become catalysts for positive change. Michelle Rodriguez, whose biased treatment of James had triggered the entire sequence of events, had completed her community service requirements and diversity training program, eventually becoming a respected advocate for unconscious bias recognition in her own right. Her transformation from perpetrator to educator demonstrated the Foundation's core belief that people could change when provided with proper education and support systems. I was wrong, and I've spent these past 5 years working to understand why I made those assumptions and how others can avoid similar mistakes, Michelle said during her appearance on the Foundation's annual conference panel. James Washington could have destroyed my life after what I did to him. Instead, he gave me the opportunity to become a better person and help prevent other people from experiencing the discrimination I caused. The conference, held annually in different cities around the world, had become the premier gathering for diversity and inclusion professionals, featuring speakers from every continent and representing every major industry sector. This year's event in Johannesburg, South Africa, attracted over 10,000 attendees and was live-streamed to audiences in every time zone. James's closing address focused on the continuing evolution of discrimination and the need for vigilance in recognizing new forms of bias as societies and technologies changed.
The assumptions that led to my poor treatment on that flight still exist in different forms today, he warned the audience. We must remain committed to questioning our own biases and creating systems that protect dignity for all people. The speech was simultaneously translated into 37 languages and shared across global social media platforms, generating millions of views and thousands of comments from people sharing their own experiences with discrimination and their commitment to creating more inclusive communities. As James concluded his remarks and accepted a standing ovation from the international audience, he reflected on the remarkable journey from a single flight experience to a global movement that had touched millions of lives and transformed countless organizations. His decision to dress modestly for volunteer work 5 years earlier had inadvertently created one of the most impactful social justice initiatives in modern history. The discrimination he experienced on Flight AA-892 had been painful and unjust, but his response had demonstrated that individual experiences of prejudice could become powerful catalysts for systemic change when combined with resources, determination, and the support of people willing to stand up for what was right. James Washington's story continued to inspire new generations of advocates, educators, and leaders who understood that the fight for dignity and equality required constant effort, but that meaningful change was possible when people chose compassion over assumptions and action over indifference.